Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Hello, my name is Maxwell Thurston, and today I will be presenting on the U.S. intelligence community failure of the January 6th Capitol attack and how cognitive biases and flawed analytical frameworks contributed to this failure. To begin with, going over an executive summary, cognitive biases and flawed analytical mindsets were critical factors in influencing the failed response and prevention of the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. Specifically in this presentation, we're going to be looking at two of these cognitive biases and frameworks in the confirmation bias and the framing effect, and how this contributed to the US intelligence community's failure to assess the threat from the right-wing extremists and disseminate potential warnings of the attack on the Capitol. And then after reviewing these cognitive biases and analytical frameworks, we're going to then go over a few reforms and policy changes that the intelligence community enacted in order to fix these mistakes. To quickly go over key judgments, we're going to be looking at two biases and analytical frameworks and the confirmation bias and the framing effect. The first one being the confirmation bias and how that resulted in the failed recognition of potential threats stemming from right-wing extremism. We'll be going over how confirmation bias was exhibited by analysts in the different departments and agencies responsible with protecting the Capitol, and how they underestimated the threat from these right-wing extremists and accepted the status quo security environment based off of what had been happening on social media in the election cycle, and how they dismissed these threats as internet chatter, and that resulted in a failure to prevent and respond to this disaster. And then lastly, we'll be going over the framing effect and how that played a major role in how the United States Capitol Police Force received information, especially from the FBI. And we'll be specifically looking at an instance in which the Capitol Police received intelligence leads from the FBI the night prior to the attack. However, the information was disseminated via email, and this caused the USCP to assign it a lower amount of importance and not follow through on it, and how this affected their response, obviously. To go over confirmation bias is our underlying cognitive tendency to focus on evidence that supports our pre-existing beliefs. Leading up to the January 6th attack, there was obviously an influx in social media postings, especially from right-wing extremism or right-wing extremist groups calling for their members to take up arms to prevent the electoral counting that was going to happen in Congress the next day. Specifically, we were seeing quotes on social media such as, "Be ready to fight. Congress needs to hear glass breaking, doors being kicked in, and blood from their Black Lives Matter movement. Get violent, stop calling this a march or a rally or a protest." And another one being, "Go there ready for war." So the FBI and Department of Homeland Security were obviously aware of this influx in social media activity, and a lot of this, hate speech coming from far-right extremist groups that supported Donald Trump and believed that the election had been wrongfully taken away from him, and that Joe Biden didn't actually win the election. The FBI and the DHS were aware of these threats. However, these threats were obviously, had been populating for quite some time, as there was an influx and tension coming from this election cycle. So they fell into a trap of, becoming relaxed with the current security environment and failing to deem these as credible threats and underestimating them. And then once again, we see these actions then conform to pre-existing beliefs by not truly being able to analyze the threat level coming from right-wing radicalism, and just accepting that they had an active voice on social media throughout the election cycle, and therefore these threats were just letting off steam and not truly credible. Another analytical mindset that was flawed and contributed to this failed response and prevention of this disaster was the framing effect. The framing effect specifically looks at the way how information is presented and how it influences our decisions. On January 5th, we see an FBI field office release a situational information report in which warns of potential violence targeting the US Capitol. And this was then disseminated from the Washington office to local law enforcement partner groups and DHS and the United States Capitol Police Force. However, this information was disseminated via email, and with it being so close to the day of the electoral counting, this was the night before on January 5th, and the email was sent late at night. So we see that testimony from these law enforcement partners, specifically from the United States Capitol Police Force, they were heavily critical how this information was disseminated by the FBI. They preferred, for something of such serious threat level, they believed that if there was an imminent danger or an imminent threat, they would have received a phone call or a briefing or some other way of disseminating that intelligence other than an email, which at the time, was assigned a lower amount of importance because of the way it was disseminated. So due to the nature of it being an email, the threat was not realized in a timely manner, and these forces ultimately blamed us for hindering their response efforts. And through these realization of some of these analytical biases and flawed frameworks of thinking, there was organizational and policy changes that were enacted in order to fix these problems in the future. Specifically looking at two different agencies, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Capitol Police Force, we see that the FBI worked to establish a greater emphasis on assessing the elevated risk that domestic violence extremists had, especially from right-wing extremism, and how to monitor social media for these threats and to not dismiss their severity, as well as working with the United States Capitol Police Force to reform communication plans and information sharing policies. We also see the United States Capitol Police Force implement initiatives to establish more effective communication plans, establish two-way communication channels between officers, leadership, and outside agencies, as well as increase communication between senior leaders and outside stakeholders in order to kind of mitigate some of the issues of this last-minute intelligence briefing and it being via email with outside partners, including between them and the FBI. And ultimately, this is how the United States Capitol Police Force and the FBI plan to mitigate these analytical mindsets and cognitive biases that affected this attack. And while there hasn't been another attack on the Capitol, you still see United States Capitol Police Force enacting reforms to this day in order to be take preemptive action and be preventative in their response efforts in order to be successful going forward. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.